Hello everyone and welcome to the Azure Spring Clean 2024 edition. Please check out the website for any information regarding the schedule as well as for the featured speakers and any related information to the event. The topic of my session is 3 areas of focus to achieve Azure operational efficiency. Kind of a short intro about myself. I do really look like this person and I am an old person yelling at cloud. A couple of links and information where you can reach out and establish contact. I'm quite active in the Macedonian IT Pro user group as well, and we're always open for any additional speakers. As far as the topics covered in this session, I'm going to spend some time shortly talking about the importance or the role of maintaining visibility and control in our cloud environment. And I'm going to touch upon 3 pillars that are referenced to Azure's operational efficiency, which would be the sandbox, the governance, and the resource optimization, kind of draw some conclusions within each area individually. When we talk about the importance of the visibility and control, it actually falls under these 4 areas here. So it's performance, security, compliance, and optimization. Right? And each area has a specific focus, which is relevant to any form of an workload running inside our cloud environment or in our hybrid deployments, well, for that matter, in our private clouds as well. So when we talk about performance, it is actually the visibility and control process that we established that helps us identify and eventually troubleshoot any specific issues related to latency, errors in our services, applications, data, whatever we have there, network, determine where the bottlenecks are and kind of overall improve our performance of the whole services we run inside. And then we're not talking only about the cloud resources in this perspective and maybe adjusting capabilities like sizing, location, any specific tweaks in the configuration, but also we'll look at the overall architecture and capability of the solution. On the security side, it helps us protect the cloud resources from any form of a cyber attack against those. So it can be malware, ransomware, phishing, denial of service attacks, any issues related to authentication authorization processes, issues with encryption, or in some cases, non-existence of encryption, etc. On the compliance side, it helps us comply with any specific regulatory requirements as well as the industry best practices relevant to our organization or our customer organization, where that might be GDPR, HIPAA, PCI DSS, anything related in regards to these frameworks. And then last but not least would be the optimization, which actually helps us further down the line optimize the cost as well as the efficiency of any form of a cloud resource we might have deployed inside the environment. Now, it also relates to underutilized or estimated as well as unused resources. Now, let's kind of dig in gradually into the 3 areas of discussion. So the first one we mentioned, it would be the sandbox, which by itself, it implies that it allows us to do some specific testing and or development of a specific service or a specific solution in a controlled environment. Right? It not only provides the control on how do we manage and deploy these resources, but also provides a specific isolation as well as security for the overall Azure environment. So out of the kind of specifics in that area, there are 2 options which I've also utilized. One would be the Azure Sandbox service architecture, and the other one would be the landing zone sandbox environment. Now, both environments, again, we can spend some time significantly talking about these, but these are flexible environments that enable us to actually start building a safe environment for our minimum viable product, testing, development, further upgrades, enhancements of the environment. So the Azure Sandbox service architecture is part of the Azure Architecture Center, and below you'll see the couple of links, and soon enough you'll realize what's the rationale behind the tiny URL provided there. So some of the components that come out of the box with this solution would be the shared services virtual network, the Bastion host, as well as the virtual machine hosting and Active Directory domain controller. Then there is a couple of instances of Jumpbox environments based on Windows and Linux. There is an application virtual network, so it follows a hub and spoke structure here, and Azure File Share. It also deploys a couple of data services like SQL Server inside a virtual machine, Azure SQL services, a PaaS service, Azure Database for MySQL, Flexible Server, and last but not least, from the networking perspective, would be the Azure Virtual WAN and point-to-site VPN connectivity. Now, again, these components are customizable. The actual GitHub repository, which is represented one of the links below, uses Terraform scripts for deployment, so any form of customization can be done. So you don't need to deploy all these components. It is used to kind of enhance and foster use as part of the use cases, self-running, hackathons, testing, development. So it has not only community value, but also it has a value as part of a specific organization when you need to do some POCs testing or whatever that's necessary in regards to the further development of a sandbox environment. Now, how do we structure the subscriptions, the management groups, and any other components? It also suggests certain naming conventions there, but again, it's highly customizable. It follows the best practices as part of the cloud adoption framework, well architecture framework, as well as the best practices in the architecture. So it's highly recommended. Again, certain components can be omitted. It's all based on your preferred design. Another option is to use the capabilities of the cloud adoption framework represented in the landing zone sandbox environment, which gives us a kind of a very specific capability, which is part of the overall landing zone enterprise or architecture that we might run, where inside the management and subscription organization environment, we do create a specific management group, in this case names as sandboxes, which will contain one or more sandbox subscriptions we might use for specific scenario. Now, use cases in this case would be the quick testing of an application design pattern, whether we are considering any form of 5 Rs, right, during the rationalization, rehosting, re-architecting, redesign, or completely creating a new cloud native application service. We can use it for evaluation of different Azure resources as well as conduct proof of concepts. We can use it to better understand what happens when a specific setting is changed and how it affects not only the actual Azure resources that was undergoing that change, but how it interacts with other capabilities and components, which again, it's not only related to just looking at the plain and simple subset of services that are part of that workload, but also specific role assignments, cost management policies, monitoring capabilities, including any specific network-related communication and intra-application communication in this area. We can use it to build and test out new Azure policies, since I mentioned it, and see how they behave. We can also use it to experiment with different new or eventually or some cases preview Azure services and on resources while we're building a specific application. With a notion that, yeah, preview services should not be used for a production, but maybe if we do some form of a testing, proof of concepting, right, designing some MVP in this case, minimum viable product, but again, we don't use or proceed with deployment of whatever we found out there in production, especially the resources in a preview. Some considerations that we might need to take, which come kind of maybe a best practice there. So consider assigning a form of an expiration date, right? What do we do with this specific subscription once we're done with the process? Now, canceling or deleting the subscription, including the resources. So the resources might be deleted, but then the subscription might linger on in the background. The general idea behind the sandbox in a kind of a nutshell would be that ultimately we won't need it anymore. Now we can do a couple of things. We can reassign the subscription to a kind of a separate management group where unassigned subscriptions exist. We kind of tighten the role-based access control model and to prevent somebody from deploying something while using that one. If we need to move it back into kind of play, then we move it first to the sandbox environment. Again, specific management group structure, as well as role-based access control, as well as policies will be applied, and then we can proceed. Now, we also need to monitor those subscriptions for costs, right? So one of the kind of quick and easiest ways to create a form of a budget threshold inside Azure Cost Management. And then once we reach a specific threshold, we'll get notified, the appropriate people will get notified so we can undertake actions. Although I've seen larger organizations that actually utilize the sandboxes and do not impose any specific cost restrictions, but that's based on internal policies and processes, because they were in a form of a rapid kind of adoption and cloud migration and developing multiple native applications in a rather complex environment. So kind of limiting the cost was not their go-to strategy here. They did a specific grooming, setting up expiration dates and kind of removing the content of a specific sandbox environment, but still they did not rely on capping the cost. They managed which type of SKUs will be deployed, because anything that was not related to the actual production or any of the other environments, so they had 4 environments they actually used until we get to production there. So they maintained clear visibility and control there in regards to restrictions. And then last but not least would be a form of information protection. One thing being that it's for every organization you might have encountered out there, it is important to maintain visibility control of the information inside a specific environment, right? This means that we need to keep the sensitive data on the same constraints and restrictions inside the sandbox environment like it would be potentially inside a production environment. Now, it also goes hand in hand in some of the use cases when we need to test specific governance model in regards to the security of the sensitive data and how the system would actually get the whole process undergoing. But again, we can operate with mockup data, but if we want to kind of be as close to the real environment as possible, then we need to do some, at least historically, aggregated data from backups or from some recovery steps done specifically so we can upload the data there. And again, this is an important capability here. So one of the things to consider here is that even before we consider assigning a user to the environment, they need to go through the specific motion run by the specific security and compliance teams inside the organization, if possible. What are the implications, right, of the actual access to the data and how they should handle it? So no difference between the sandbox environment and the actual production environment where the data is stored. Now, when we figure out how to create an operational baseline, and then again, we can talk for hours on this one. So these are some of the things that I find useful, and we can always argue about that one. But one of the important things that I figure out early in the stage of the cloud adoption was that we do need to work on the common operating model. And the common operating model implies how the processes will be run inside the environment, because we kind of fail to look sometimes at our IT teams that they're part of the core business. They're not a solution provider, they're not an external service, they're not a hosting service for us, they're part of the core business. And I think that it's decided on the business side will affect the IT operations in general. I'm going to kind of generalize the IT department here, and vice versa. Any IT operational decisions will also influence the business. And it's a synergy at the end of the day in regards to that. Hand in hand with that one, we don't assign too much responsibility to a small team, because it's never a good thing. We don't want to overwhelm the team, right? This is a decision point, and yeah, small and mid-sized organizations usually struggle with this one, but larger organizations, enterprise organizations, and it also goes hand in hand with their operational model. It kind of it is implied that sometimes they do have enough people, although my experience also tells me in a complex organization there is overburden and a few people wear too many hats at the end of the day. But if the team is rather small, then assigning too many responsibilities can create a confusion. It will kind of disassociate the process of communication between the teams, as well as kind of create gaps, and we don't want gaps in certain areas. One of the important findings, and I found in this particular item, is when you should not rush ahead of the curve, especially when you see, oh, this is a very new cool service, or this is a previous service. And previous service is a kind of a no-brainer. There is no assigned SLA, so if something happens, and this is in production environment, Microsoft cannot provide the support for this. Right? So no SLA, no support options. A new service would be a good idea, but then let's go back to the sandbox environment, see how what happens when we introduce it, see how the architecture will change, and kind of go through the whole due diligence process of the environment. I mean, yeah, we might get hyped, we might get excited about how things are going, but it's not a good thing inside. So do not assume that the release service is always ready for production inside a specific environment. Might differ from case to case, but don't rush. It all boils down to the rapid development of the cloud. There's always going something new. And I'm not talking about simple name changes or kind of grouping certain services under a new umbrella, like the OpenAI thing that happened recently, but it's more like a features and functionalities inside the service. In conjunction with that, kind of let me additional thing, do not always assume that whatever we provision inside the cloud environment as part of a solution is will or is increasing the resiliency and availability of the service. So we have multiple components there which are affected by specific operational process, but any issues with that services will not only affect the single instance, but it also might affect other workloads that communicate with that service as well. Yeah, most of the services do have advantages there. PaaS and SaaS services do have some reliability and resilience inside, but don't sleep on that year on. One of the things that for me is a huge no-go is don't move things into adoption phase just because you can't do them in planning phase. Because all the misalignment steps, all the things you missed during the planning phase of the cloud adoption process, once we get to the adoption, they will become very huge obstacle. Right? Now, this happens specifically when there is a lot of responsibility to a small team. They don't have enough time to do things, so they move them. Oh, we're going to do it in planning phase. Never do that. I mean, it's not good for anyone. And in several cases, I saw a situation where, especially if it's related to governance side of the operations, where we have gotten almost to the end of the project, and then things that were omitted in the planning phase actually popped up in the adoption phase, and then we had to go back to the drawing board. And that was a specific scenario, was at the end of the process involved, but then it can happen. And last but not least, tooling, whether you use multiple tools, even worse, multiple tools to kind of look at the same capability, it doesn't improve operations. So I know that automation, DevOps is kind of a big thing, but introducing that specific tool to enhance the operations might have also a reverse effect. Now, there might be different reasons for that. One, again, falls under the don't always rush ahead. And I will kind of address certain aspects of that one as well. But still, be careful with that. Now, there is a plethora of tools that are native to Azure, that are third party, that can be customized. You might find it somewhere in the community side, but be careful. Right? Do the due diligence, do proper evaluation, and be careful. Otherwise, it always happens to go back to the defaults. So when we're, as humans, uncomfortable with something due to a change, due to introduction of something new, due to some fast or not properly structured adoption process, for example, or planning process, we go back to the defaults. And when we go back to the defaults, we don't listen to anything outside of what we know. Right? It's our comfort zone at the end of the day. But when we think of crafting the governance policies, and again, a lot can be said here, there are a couple of areas that I want to touch upon here. So embracing the evolving frameworks. This implies in a nutshell that whenever we introduce a form of a cloud service in an already on-premise incumbent organization, we need to adapt the already established conventional IT governance model. Now, this also comes to as a shock to the environment because these principles are not easy to change. It's kind of very rigid, right? Because we need to have the capacity to literally reconstruct the entire virtual data center we might have and then move it to the cloud environment where we utilize and benefit a lot of capabilities, including high level of automation there. So shifting even on paper, the traditional paradigm is a problem for certain organization. And the bigger, the larger and more regulated the organization is, then they're more strict and kind of almost inflexible governance policies. Not to mention the actual government entities, and you might have some experience with that. We need to do the corporate policy alignment, right? Once we start introducing cloud capabilities inside an on-premises organization, this is the process of changing, and this is the process when the corporate policy needs to be aligned. Now, a lot of organizations, again, have a little bit more structure, but small and mid-size might be lacking that. But in a large organization, this is an issue. And as we progress, there will be changes, fluctuations, updates, modifications of the policy to affect more and more services that move there, right? We usually start with a kind of a smaller service that won't rock the boat too much, as it is kind of the saying would be the low-hanging fruits, because this is the way how we learn. This is how we prep the rest of the organization that a change is coming, and they should be aware of the process, and then they should be kind of in pace with the rest of the teams involved in the process. Last but not least, although I mentioned some other stuff around the tools, so maximizing tool proficiency. Again, there is a plethora of tools that can use natively or external to kind of foster this process. Once we determine which tools will be used, we need to get proficient with those. We need to know what are the expected results, whether they're IT operations related, whether they're governance related, whatever touches upon the environment. Hence, everybody needs to understand what the result of the tool is, eventually identify specific gaps so we can move forward. Now, the idea of the governance, whenever we kind of start, and preferably do it from scratch if it's possible, it is boxing, right? So we embed it inside the design based on identifying and understanding the specific corporate risks, which are related to the business risks. Then we look at the already existing, preferably, policies and compliance requirements. Then we convert those risks into specific statements to support that compliance requirement. And then once we apply this, we look at the processes, which is a way of ensuring the adherence to the stated policies. A couple of tools mentioned here: Azure Policy, Azure Blueprints, Defender for Cloud, Azure Deployment Environments, Azure Assessments can be used, and they have different kind of point of view for different people. So the Azure Assessments in most cases are more kind of, those results are more appealing to the business side, but the rest of the components can be used primarily to IT operations. And then I generalize IT operations, whether it's security or the, let's say, regular operations. So from a business risk perspective, kind of can add something here. If we are in the early stage of cloud adoption, this would imply a lot of experimenting and building proof of concepts. And then, as I said before, we kind of go for the low business impact, non-mission critical systems. Hence, the business risks would be different when I try to move my core database service or some of the core applications and the data stored inside. So from a technical standpoint, we look at kind of synergy between the corporate policies and the transformation efforts we underrun in the organization specifically. Now, when we think of applying a governance, especially in a hybrid scenario, or in this case, particularly when we kind of move certain workloads to the cloud and then when we a little bit more, I mean, it's baby steps. We start small and expand. It can add some additional complexity to the process itself, because we might have a mix of policies related to business risks for on-premises systems, for a hybrid scenario, for a purely cloud system environment. Kind of can create some kind of friction there, but if we perceive it in an appropriate time frame, then kind of we can, in a short to mid-term, mitigate that issue from that standpoint. Now, again, as far as the policy and compliance, needless to say, we're talking about cost management, security baseline, identity baseline, and the deployment acceleration or the automation we're going to introduce. And again, these are the disciplines inside we kind of tackle them. If we can in parallel, that's fine. But if not, we tackle them at kind of a specific pace inside. Never forget the education, whether we're talking about the IT operations teams, whether we're talking about security compliance, governance teams, ultimately the end users. Never forget that, because they should follow up every step and part of the process of the cloud adoption. So if you look at the kind of snippets of wisdom for the operational baseline for governance, always have in mind or bear in mind that cloud adoption creates disruption. It disrupts the processes, it disrupts the people, it disrupts the operation. And then it follows with the policies, the governance, the security, the costs inside. So be careful with the construct shared responsibilities. And I'm not talking about the inside responsibilities, but the shared responsibilities between your organization and the cloud provider itself. Again, do not sleep on the ear for something. So be aware of that, because that will affect how your business risks are assessed. Because for certain things, you do have control. But for certain things, the cloud provider has control on those capabilities and features, functionalities of a service. So we cannot go beyond what's presented to us as a responsibility. So in shared responsibility model, we need to be aware what the specific SLAs are, how the responsibility falls on the shoulders of the users, or the user of the cloud service in this case, or the actual provider of the cloud service. Do not forget about cloud security. Yes, we might consider that a specific cloud service X is XYZ times more secure than an on-premises environment, maybe with less complexity, especially if we're talking about platform or software as a service environments. But we should not rely only on that. I'm not saying that it's not secure, but does not imply that we leave it like that. It's an evolving and constantly evolving security landscape out there. So whatever we did as part of our security operations, we should continue doing them inside the cloud. We harvest the benefits and capabilities of the tools, of the services that are there, of the kind of built-in security and capability of the service itself, but still we maintain visibility and control on everything. Don't get creative with the security frameworks. I've seen a couple of smaller organizations that try to kind of not amend, but customize an already established framework of some kind, right? Whether it's CIS, whether it's Microsoft provided, whether it's industry practice or whatever, right? So the saying is usually, oh, yeah, this is too big for us, we're too small. It's we do things in a particular way instead, right? Any deviations from that would imply that any security controls we established on a kind of customized security framework, we need to revisit each time there's an update, there is a change, and we need to maintain, again, visibility and control on that one. There is a reason why that framework was already introduced and supported and backed by different security providers, right? So don't get creative there. Do spend some time on the RACI matrix, responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. Again, might get crazy in a smaller team, but in a larger team will give you a kind of neat structure. And there is a kind of an Excel sheet you can use for that one if you don't have the idea where to start. Just gives you the structure, and then you can determine based on where you are in your cloud adoption process, who are the go-to people for certain things, right? Especially who has the responsibilities for a specific workload, who is accountable for certain operations revolving that workload, who is consultant, right? Again, no matter where the organization they're related to that specific workload, and who is just informed as part of the process. This will also imply that kind of structure the teams. So each person knows where they're at in regards to specific capability. Also remember that some features, capabilities come with higher premium type of subscriptions and or SKUs, right? So now this will affect other aspects, and that's in most cases cost structure. But again, we need to do a specific due diligence and then measure whether this specific service with these capabilities is suited for my specific needs, or I need to do something else. And for example, the architecture center, Azure Architecture Center covers a lot of design patterns that will help you kind of streamline, especially if you move from on-premise to the cloud, and how that these design patterns change. Because again, as I always say, cloud is an asynchronous distributed environment. Whatever we had on premises, it's very static compared to that one. This one is constantly evolving. And last but not least, kind of a glimpse on that one. Do not neglect the learning process, the education of the users, any type, any person that touches upon the cloud. And it never ends. You might have noticed that. Now, one of the areas discussed also would be the resource optimization, right? So if we start using Azure to run the workloads, yeah, after a while, we might start wondering how to optimize the environment. And the cost is first on our mind, or everybody's mind. We have the performance, availability, and security. Now, there are kind of three go-to options you might have heard already: the shutdown on unused resources, or eventually delete certain resources that are not used, right-size the resources, and then use some form of reservation, whether it's on the infrastructure or platform size. Right, it can be related to a virtual machine, it can be related to a storage capability, whatever service there that supports a form of reservation, right? So shutting down, it's a kind of a very easy, straightforward, no-brainer. Used it a couple of times, works quite fine in certain small and mid-sized organizations. For example, we worked with an organization that ran their business between 9 and 5. They had a kind of a small backup window during the day. It was around 2 hours. Then a weekly backup was done. And then at the end of the month, a monthly backup. So we use the shutdown and startup automation capabilities by using tags. Did not refer to them till now, but these are part of the several processes based on which a particular order for shutdown the VMs was done at a particular time frame, and then the next day in the morning a boot process was done. And this was also done when the weekly, weekend backup and the monthly backup were done, again, both cases during the weekend. So we not only optimized the costs, but also we optimized certain backup and operation processes involving the machine. The machines involved. Now, again, certain services, especially in a platform environment, for example, application services can be paused, so they won't consume any credits or don't generate costs. And there's some other services that, for example, I don't know, VPN gateway, you have the cost for the provision gateway, but you don't have a cost for the data transfers if nobody uses it. But certain services, and you should kind of investigate additionally that one, of course, offer the capability of pausing or reducing the costs, right? So it can be PaaS appliances as well. On the networking side, it can be application services as part of the PaaS infrastructure, database SKUs, etc. That can actually foster the cost optimization here. But there is always a trade-off, of course, remember. If I need to achieve availability and I want to achieve cost, if I shut down the service, it's not available anymore. Right? So it might be additionally secure there, but still it's not available. Now, right sizing of the resources, it's easier said than done sometimes. One thing is when we do it during the initial assessment, and on the next slide, I'll show some of the tools and kind of you'll notice and recognize most of them, of course. Right sizing is a process, right? So if I do use Azure Migrate, for example, to analyze, or any other tool, third-party tool that does the same operation, I need to allocate certain amount of time so I can properly analyze, for example, if it's an infrastructure as a service, how the virtual machines behave, and what would be the most appropriate SKU to be used inside the cloud. And it will not only be the VM SKU, but also the storage capabilities and the network capabilities of that virtual machine. And this will be different from what we had on premises, a physical virtual machine on a colocation provider somewhere, and then until we get to the Azure side. It's not a one-to-one match, of course. Another option is if you want to do a kind of a balance between cost, performance, availability, security, we start small, for example, utilize the smaller SKUs, especially for the VMs, and then kind of build up from there. So the trade-off here would be I might achieve better availability and performance if I spin up additional smaller instances of a VM and do horizontal scaling, but I need to monitor the tipping point of the cost. If the cost becomes too big compared to just scaling up the VM, then go for that. And you can also automate the process, but then again, you need to monitor first and then proceed with any right sizing. I've also seen scenarios where, depending on the time frame of the day or within the month or year, the SKUs are kind of reduced. Now, again, it boils down to the functionality. So if it's a PaaS service and this capability goes with a specific SKU, you cannot do this. But let's say for the virtual machines, you can scale them down to a lower, so scale up, scale down, right? But again, can get tricky, can get complex to manage and monitor, and if you don't automate, can get crazy. So be careful with that. Last but not least would be using different types of reservations, right? So reserve instances, we pre-purchase the VM, CPU, and memory allocations, so we can actually predict what our monthly or annual or 3-year upfront cost would be for that VM. Again, we can also do it for storage services, and right, it's based on the Azure storage. So anything that touches upon Azure storage can do a kind of a reserved instance of storage, which operates in larger capacities, of course, and that's where it makes sense, actually. So we get a lower price for storage per, let's say, petabyte, rather than doing pay-as-you-go models in this perspective. The same will apply for the VMs, right? There is also option to use spot instances, but be careful because it is bound to a specific type of workload inside. So batch processing, your testing environments can use that one, your development environment, right? So it is an option to use it, but it's reserved instances for virtual machines as well as spot instances are related to infrastructure services. For the PaaS services, need to be kind of there's options, but yeah, it boils down to whether that specific service is part of the solution or not. Now, as far as the tools goes, Azure Monitor, Azure Advisor, Cost Management, Defender for Cloud, Azure Reservations, Spot Instances, Azure Hybrid Benefit. Again, the last 3 in the line there are related to bring your own license, which means I have some virtual machines, which means I can use reservations or spot instances. The Defender for Cloud will give me, so why it is kind of here where kind of when the Microsoft Defender portfolio means something else. It's not only just for compliance, security, and the overall well-being of the environment and optimization, but also any weird behavior on the services itself might not only be related to security or some misconfiguration, but it also will affect the cost. So if I misconfigure the scale out capabilities of a VM, it will scale out without maybe control, or when it's not supposed to scale out, that will affect the cost. Or if I see unusual behavior coming from a specific instance of a service, which might be a result of a poor security configuration or error in the code, it will spike or generate some security events maybe, or it was maybe not compromised, but it will generate some security events for that. From that standpoint, as an unusual behavior, we can kind of boil it down that it will increase the cost, but it's not a security issue. It's a kind of a more operational issue from the inside capabilities, right? Now, the cost management is a go-to environment. You can do budgets. It won't cut off the services. It will just send alerts. So you need to sit down still with your finance operations teams. Microsoft is part of the FinOps framework, and there is a separate Azure for FinOps for Azure set of documentation you can go through. Anything that's aggregated as a bit and piece of information from the environment is the same thing that Azure Advisor uses in the areas of security, performance, availability, and cost. It uses AI in the background, and this is area probably where AI will get more and more proficient, and you might revisit different cost management and some predictions there from the Azure Spring Clean contributors as well. So there are a couple of interesting articles I found earlier as well. So when we look at the kind of optimizing the resources efficiently, again, monitoring is a crucial aspect of any cloud-based application or service, right? Because it not only provides the security information, it will also give us a notion where there is an issue with the service itself that might generate some additional cost there. Or we might perceive the momentum where a specific VM size or a specific SKU or a specific appliance we use does not fit our, it is a bottleneck, which means, or it's over provisioning instances rather than scaling up, it's going horizontal scaling. So we can find the issue fairly quickly. Now, one of the important things is when we do and choose our operational model, so how do we structure our IT operations and how do we kind of mature in the process, we need to develop the cost model. And preferably the cost model will have some changes as the maturity of our operational model changes. So whatever the operational model we choose is, the cost model aims at segmenting those expenses, estimate, and eventually forecast the total cost of ownership of a specific cloud solution we actually have inside the organization, right? So it will help you identify specific cost drivers or pitfalls, if I may use that one, very early. So we can do predictions, some modeling there, and determine how the architecture would be affected. Not only from the actual architecture of the solution, but anything from an operations side that touches upon that specific architecture. So it's a journey, right? It's not a destination that we're looking for. It's a journey. I would recommend bi-weekly meetings for cost analysis. So aggregate the costs on a weekly basis, do a quick checkup, but kind of drilling down with the team on a bi-weekly basis, especially in the early stage until we stabilize. Eventually, when we introduce new capabilities, new services, or something in the maturity level has kind of went up, we need to go back. And when I said financial operation teams or FinOps teams, it might be just the solution architect and the finance person in that one initially, right? The larger organization would have a little bit more people, and there will be the application owner, the business owner, the finance team, as well as the representatives of operation teams. But again, certain things might pop up even prior to this bi-weekly meeting of the kind of joint team. Again, it boils down to the monitoring. So if an anomaly is detected, then if it's the root cause analysis is done and it's related to certain things that will increase the cost on the solution, then we can kind of speed things up in that area. Budget control needs to be established as a form as a result of any changes or adding requirements, modifying requirements, whatever it's related, either it comes from the IT side or from the business side. Because on one hand, whatever we predicted within maybe our cloud adoption plan initially, so the actual cost might exceed the plan. So we need to kind of revisit it and maybe do it again. Specific business conditions changed, right? Expanding to new markets, adding new services, I don't know, adding new location, mergers, anything that's, well, might be a lot of things based on a business decision. This will for sure affect the architecture as well as the service capabilities, and then tackle on the IT operations and anything that goes inside. So IT operations is everything inside. So remember that cost optimization trade-offs do exist, right? So if I reduce resiliency, that might also affect reductions in security, visibility. We might do under or over provisioning there, right? It might provide limitations to our business continuity and disaster recovery strategy, right? If a specific workload, it's not designed as highly available, it's not part of the embedded service that we deployed as a PaaS component or SaaS component, right? That will affect the business continuity and disaster recovery policy, which means it will affect the IT operations in the area of maintenance. There will be no specific optimization path there, right? Might fall under the risk of a single point of failure, but again, It boils down to the architecture itself. Another things that might happen, it might add in complexity. So if I'm not using certain performance and availability capabilities of the service provider environment, means that there will be added complexity. So I need to do a workaround to kind of amend maybe our BCDR capabilities or maintenance cycles, etc. So it will adhere with some additional complexity there, and it will actually ultimately increase the workload area. Instead of, I don't know, looking at 5 to 7 workloads, we have additional 3 that will support the gaps that happen during the trade-offs, right? Any form of incremental improvements we do, they matter because they will affect the optimization processes, not only maybe cost, but other capabilities as well. And ultimately, it all falls back to the governance. Because if we get to the cost optimization, we surely went through the governance model, and one of the pillars is cost optimization. It is not written in stone, but if we start with a good governance baseline, we can for sure easily expand that no matter what the operational model was, because a good governance model gives us a proper cost model, and then we can build up on top of that. And again, we can talk for hours, for days, but there are a lot of excellent sessions around there that might cover the gaps that we missed here in this specific session. With this, I would like to thank you for being part of the Azure Spring Clean 2024 edition. I sure had fun. Reach out if you have any insights, tips, tricks you might want to share, and go for sure visit the Azure Spring Clean website for the next sessions or some of the sessions and articles that you might have missed. So once again, thank you and see you around.